welcome everybody to Unite LA's Education Means Business webinar, our very first webinar of the year. We're excited to kick off this very important conversation of our administration's commitments to everything cradle-to-career education. We're thrilled to have everyone join us today for this conversation, and I'll go ahead and just quickly introduce myself. I'm Sonia Campos Rivera. I serve as a Senior VP of Public Policy at Unite LA. For those that are new to Unite LA is a nonprofit organization working to build bridges and relationships between the business and education communities on everything cradle-to-career policy, programs, and systems efforts. We do so with the intention of shedding light on very important issues that are critical to California's youth and families, especially for our most vulnerable youth, our youth of color. So we do so by building these types of relationship with the business community. We feel that education leaders and our business partners need to be at the same table having these type of dialogues so that we can work together to identify solutions for some of California's challenges as it pertains to cradle-to-career policy issues. Before we get started, team, I do want to pause and reflect just for a minute, if I may, with your permission, just to pause to think about what's going on in our state. It is difficult to be on this webinar today and not acknowledge how many of our communities in our backyard, Monterey Park, Oakland, Half Moon Bay, and throughout the state, we're just all being affected by it. So I do want to just recognize all the families that have been affected, the communities that are struggling, and I think as a state in general, it's a very sad time for our state as it pertains to our safety and our future. But anyway, thought it would just be so important to just pause and reflect on that for a quick minute. So today's conversation, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the importance of our proposed budget, which was unveiled January 10th. I'm going to hand it over to our president, Alicia Bell, to introduce our two distinct speakers. But before I do, just want to set a little bit of context. Almost 3 years ago, we were expecting us to go into a historical recession, and we were faced with a surplus during the first 2 years of the pandemic. And in that surplus, it was great to see the administration really take on some of the most important issues and really lifted the importance of equity and ensuring that those that have been historically marginalized were seen in this budget. We saw some of the challenges of childcare centers closing down, some temporarily and others permanently. We saw that EC providers, primarily women of color, really finding it difficult to return back to the workforce. We saw historical disenrollments in our community college system. And in that process, we saw the administration really grab these issues and go head on to and identify solutions by making some significant investments these last 2 years in our education system. As we're going into a slowdown within California's economy, we're just eager to hear from these two speakers on what we're going to be expecting. And to facilitate that conversation, as I mentioned, we're going to hand it over to our president, Alicia Bell, who will be introducing our two great speakers. So Alicia, the floor is yours. And again, everyone, thank you for being with us today. Look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and welcome to our speakers, Chris Ferguson and Chris Hoene. We so appreciate your continued partnership in Unite LA's webinars these past few years, and we're grateful you spend your time and energy with us to share your expertise and help us think through our questions. I also want to thank everyone who dialed in to take part in today's conversation. We are going to be joined by nearly 150 participants representing business, advocacy, the funder community, as well as civic leaders. So thank you all. And as Sonia mentioned, in Unite LA's role as an intermediary, we help to inform collaborative efforts, including early childhood care and education, college access and success, and pathways to high-wage, high-growth careers. And through that work, we aim to combat structural racism and dismantle systemic barriers that impact individuals from historically marginalized communities, with a goal of ensuring equitable access to high quality education and employment. So with that, I'm excited to dive in. We're thrilled to have these two distinct state leaders to discuss the proposed budget unveiled by Governor Newsom on January 10th. So very brief intros. Chris Ferguson is a program budget manager at the California Department of Finance, where he leads the office's team of experts covering the early education, K-12, and higher education portfolios. He's been at the Department of Finance since 2007. Chris Hoene is with us as well, and he serves as the executive director for the California Budget and Policy Center. And he is a very dynamic leader who strives to build relationships and a collective vision with a range of partners and people. That includes the Budget Center team, policymakers, advocates, organizers, the media, and funders. So with that, we're going to begin with Chris Ferguson, and then we'll give the floor to Chris Hoene, and then we'll open it up for Q&A at the end of their remarks. We have received a handful of questions in advance of today's call, but we will leave the chat open. So for anything you want to ask, please pop it into the chat and we will do our best to get to everyone's questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Chris Ferguson to start us off. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Alicia. And first, just thank you everyone for joining us today. I think I can see that there's roughly 64 people that are here. You know, there could be up to 140 that join us over the course of the discussion. So really appreciative that folks are taking their time today to have this discussion. So we're in a bit of a different position this year when it comes to the budget, in that the past couple of years have seen robust revenue growth such that, you know, the state was in a position to make substantial new investments in programs. So this year is a little more tame. What we're seeing from a revenue perspective is revenues were down about 29.5 billion. But with other natural adjustments in the budget, that meant that we had a hole of roughly $22.5 billion to cover. What we did in this budget, just architecturally, is we looked to reductions, delays, fund shifts to largely fill that gap, so that we could maintain the overall progress in a lot of the core areas of the budget the past few years. So specifically, when we think about, say, education, it's maintaining progress towards fully implementing and expanding the access to transitional kindergarten. It's maintaining our focus on providing students with disabilities, you know, additional opportunities in our California state preschool programs. We've maintained our significant investments in our school system. We've maintained the compacts with the UC, CSU, and the roadmap with the California community colleges, all of which have a tint toward how we can better serve our families and students from the start all the way through, you know, college and into the workforce. And when I say into the workforce, sometimes that's going to be out of high school, sometimes that will be, you know, out of a community college, a four-year university. It could be another training program. But we maintain most of those investments, and we maintain the progress that we've really seen over the past 2 years. So some of the core investments, I'll start with our K-12 side of the budget. Some of the core investments that we've done in our K-12 education budget is a $4.2 billion adjustment for growth in COLA. Effectively, we've seen inflation impact our schools such that the statutory COLA is predicted to be about 8.13%, the largest I've ever seen in my career at the Department of Finance. You know, I would say it's almost 2% higher than the next largest that I've seen. So very, very robust, but we were able to maintain that. We were able to maintain all of the workforce investments for teacher workforce that we put in the budget the past couple of years that were intended to be multi-year investments. We were also able to maintain the progress toward transitional kindergarten. So that continues. And what that means in the budget is that roughly another 690 million plus another 165 million for adult or for employee to student ratios is included in that education budget to continue that progress. So schools are being funded for those students. They're being funded for the extra employee to be in those classrooms as well. You know, architecturally, the guarantee does come down a little bit because revenues have come down. But luckily, the way we had constructed past education budgets, we were using some of the ongoing money for one-time purposes. So when that came off the books, it helped us avoid the roller coasters that we'd seen, during the Great Recession. So I think it's worked out quite nicely to end the roller coaster this year. We maintain a reserve of $8.5 billion to assist us in future years. We also are able to maintain, and we continue the focus of when we do have to do even a slight reduction, say this year it was $1.2 billion to the arts, music, and instructional materials discretionary block grant. We do so because it enables us to maintain other investments like the Golden State Pathways program that we put forward last year, that's really intended to say, how can we help our high school seniors, better focus on certain career aspects that are in in-demand industries in California, or where we're seeing, staffing shortages in California? How can we help them, transition either into career or community college or four-year university? So all of those investments have been maintained. I would say in the higher education sphere, both the UC and the CSU received increases of over 200 million ongoing, and we maintain the focus on the compacts with both. As folks may recall, one of the key features of the compact is a direct focus on, for the CSU, enrolling more students in certain high demand areas like education, technology, climate resiliency, healthcare. And then on the UC side, it's about graduating more students in those same areas. So certainly we maintain that focus on the compacts. We maintain a focus on keeping college affordable. There are no reductions in any of the proposed financial aid programs. So that's, the middle class scholarship is funded consistent with the budget agreements from the past couple of years. The Cal Grant program continues to be funded at its expected level. And then lastly, we continue, our investments long-term on child savings accounts. In fact, because of declining enrollment on the K-12 side of the budget, we're actually able to afford a little bit more in terms of seed deposits for newborns. So we propose increasing that from $25 to $100 to really start from the beginning and, set an expectation that college is an option for all, and that training is an option for all. So I close it out with probably, my favorite higher education system, and it's my favorite because it's the largest. Which means it has, it provides services to the most students in California, and that's our California community colleges. In the California community college budget, we are able to maintain an 8.13% cost of living adjustment, but we have a couple of policy things that we put forward that I think are, important to note. One is we signal to our community college districts an expectation that they begin recouping and regaining some of that lost enrollment during the pandemic years. And in particular, we don't say what the mechanism will be, but we say as an incentive that in the 24-25 budget, we will introduce a mechanism to adjust college budgets if they're not regaining some of that lost enrollment. So certainly that's been a big concern of ours. We know we need a trained workforce. We know we need, skilled students who have certificates, who have degrees, who are transferring to four-year universities. So we put that forward. We've also put forward some incentive to make progress toward the goals of the community college roadmap, which is their version of a compact. And within that, one of the things that we put forward is we've said at May, we'll come up with a proposal that allows some flexibility within some of their programs, so long as they're making progress towards those overall goals. So as we think about equity, I know I'm a bit all over the place, but as we think about equity, both in the compacts and the roadmap, it says very clearly that our statewide goal, and this is the right goal, is to close all equity gaps, right? We think all students should have the opportunity to be successful. We think we should be focusing on ensuring all of the students that are attending a community college, a UC or CSU, are generally going to graduate and complete their programs at similar rates. So that focus, in the community college budget, we try to incent the colleges to focus on the goals of the roadmap by providing them some flexibility. And we've heard from some of our leaders in the system that they would like that flexibility so that they can better craft, a comprehensive program. And then lastly, to really help, inspire students and show them, one, that community college is an option and college is an option writ large. We have asked, we don't require it, there won't be, any legal requirement to do it, but we've asked the community college system to set up dual enrollment agreements with all public high schools in the state. And we asked them to also offer a 1-unit service learning course to all high school students in the state. So we view that as, one, helping students understand, the civic nature of our cities, become engaged in volunteerism, become engaged in understanding the industries in their community or the opportunities in their community. But we also view that as an opportunity to expand the number of students who then view that community college is an option for them and college is an option for them, and that they can be successful in it. We've seen some recent studies out of, current community college district that clearly show that students who are enrolled in dual enrollment programs attend college at a higher rate. They transfer into 4-year universities at a higher rate. They graduate with a degree or a certificate at a higher rate. So there's a lot of promise there. So, we've definitely asked the system to focus on dual enrollment and focus on establishing service learning courses for that reason. Certainly, I think you have one of the just a fabulous chancellor at LA Community College District. There are great presidents throughout the LA basin, whether that's, President Curry down at Compton College, even heading into Orange County with President Martinez or Chancellor Martinez down there, formerly of East LA. I think they're well primed to, meet the measures of the roadmap. They're well primed to implement dual enrollment programs. And I think they're primed to really start roaring back in enrollment and in helping students complete their programs. Because from our perspective, it's not just enrollment. It's also seeing that we're providing the support to get students through those programs. So I think I'd leave that as sort of my high level presentation. Education has done very well given the construct of the budget, but the opportunities remain. And, the impacts or reductions or delays have been very minimal in the education budget.
Thank you, Chris, very much for those opening remarks. We really appreciate that overview of the proposed budget. And we have a few discussion questions. Before we dive in, I want to agree on the kudos for Chancellor Rodriguez, as well as all of the other community college leaders you mentioned. I should acknowledge that Unite LA is blessed to have Chancellor Rodriguez serve as chairman of our board, so we get to learn from him regularly. You mentioned a lot of exciting elements of the 2023 budget, and we'd love to hear a little bit more about what excites you personally, if there's something specifically in that cradle-to-career education workforce development investment, as well as if there's something else that excites you outside of education.
Yeah, I think there's probably two things that excite me the most in education. And one is, from my perspective, when I'm advising the governor, I think of education as one system. And I think we've really focused the past couple of years, and we continue that focus this year, on trying to have both our early education, our K-12 education system, our higher education system, working as one, or being seen as one system rather than independent systems, rather than independent entities, really trying to continue the work of having folks blur the lines and really think of it as a system, which leads to the second thing that I'm very excited and passionate about dual enrollment, because the data is very clear on what it means for students and what it means for, underrepresented students in particular. The same study out of Kern showed that there's a disproportionate impact on helping underrepresented students, enroll in college, see that college is an option, and complete the programs, which, we all know leads to higher economic mobility for those students. And it's just, to me, it's wonderful that we're able to maintain that focus, and we're able to work with the system to really look at dual enrollment as an opportunity to continue moving forward. Outside of education, I think what excites me the most about California's budget and our structure over the last several years is, one, we take a prudent approach, so we don't see, a lot of the reductions and a lot of the disruptions that we saw during the Great Recession. But at the same time, what we do see is a continued focus on what makes California, California, which is we're always the innovative leader. We're always looking to the next thing of what can California, help lead in. We've got emerging industries in the Lithium Valley now. We have focus on technology, and really it's, I think they call it Internet 3, and how we can use that technology to expand, our industries in California. We have historically been leaders in climate resiliency, but all of those industries were developed because California is innovative. And I would say that a lot of that innovation tracks back to our education systems. It's our public systems, it's our community colleges, it's the CSU and the UC. And it's that real construct that excites me. It means that we always have hope for a bright future, that if you live in California, you have an opportunity for a bright future.
Thank you for that, Chris. And thank you earlier in your comments for touching on early care and education. Diving in a little deeper there, of course, one of the state's major needs is increased reimbursement rates for ECE providers. And as we aim to help those providers stay open for business and allow working parents to remain in the workforce, can you share a bit of your thoughts on what we've accomplished these last couple of years and how this budget hopes to address reimbursement rates? Yeah,
so my understanding of the reimbursement rates is in 21-22, there were significant increases. This budget maintains those increases. A lot of the federal funds that were initially used to support those increases are now coming off the books. That money had come forward from the federal government via the stimulus packages, was limited term in nature, but the state is now providing general fund to support and sustain those increases. The other thing that's changed dynamically is in 21-22, we had the first agreement with Child Care Providers United, and I believe that they will be negotiating and discussing a successor agreement in the upcoming year, which I think is the next important step. Certainly, I believe the discussion will probably focus on what the rate structure looks like. Right now, for the most part, there are two rates. There's the standard reimbursement rate and the regional market rate. They're two different rates. It becomes very difficult to understand, and translate into what that means for pay and what that means for our staff. But one of the goals overall is how can we move forward in a way that supports our programs. And then what I would add is, at least on the state preschool program, in the interim, we have proposed the cost of living adjustment to the program. So that 8.13% COLA is applied to our CSPP program right now. So, definitely can't say what those collective bargaining discussions will look like, but I know they will be underway, and I know that there's a focus on what the needs of the programs are and how we can operate in a way that is more understandable or easier to navigate for folks.
Thank you so much. And just one more question before we transition over to Chris Hoene. You mentioned the 2023 proposed budget maintains investments in the teacher workforce, and would love to know if you could share any insights as it pertains to our bilingual educator workforce.
Yeah, I think, we don't propose any new investments around our bilingual educator workforce. But we know in the past couple of budgets that we've had some focus on that. We know that California has a need for a diverse and multilingual workforce. Whether it's I think I don't have I'm trying to think of the latest number, but I know that there are just many different languages in California, depending on the region. What I would say, though, is within our core programs, certainly we try to accommodate both dual language learners and staff to serve those dual language learners. So we continue to understand that. We continue to focus on it. I think that's what I would offer there.
Thank you so much. And I have lots of questions about the great comments you made about looking forward with our community college system, but I will save those so that we can hear from Chris Hoene, and then I'm sure we'll have some questions from participants during the Q&A section. So thank you so much, Chris Ferguson. And with that, we will turn it over to Chris Hoene for some opening comments.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I appreciate Chris's thorough walkthrough there, and would agree with his overall assessment. As an organization outside of state government that tracks budget conditions across a range of programs and services, I would say, as a start, that I generally agree that one of the strengths of this budget is that it actually maintains investments both from prior years and in cradle-to-career education. And I agree with Chris's comment about the administration's focus and the legislature's also agreed upon focus on the sort of thinking of the system across the system. That's been a very good set of developments in terms of the policies that have been put forward over time. So let me talk a little bit just about some of the good aspects that we see in the budget. Like I said, one of the things is across the state budget that the governor's proposed, there's a protection of ongoing investments in core programs and services that were expanded or that were invested in recent years when we were in times of so-called surplus, right? When the revenues were coming in really well. And so that includes most of the cradle-to-career investments that have been made. The exception there is on some occasion is for infrastructure and facility investments that in some cases are being deferred to later years, but that's good fiscal policy when you're facing a budget deficits. And in some instances, those facilities, that facilities sort of infrastructure spending might have rolled out a little slowly anyway, so the deferral doesn't have the same impact as if you were, say, having to cut core programs and services. Outside of the cradle-to-career investment space, you'll see the same thing in safety net and cash assistance programs where prior years' commitments are mostly being maintained. Expansion of healthcare coverage for low-income Californians and people with disabilities that has been particularly expanded for Californians who are undocumented continues forward, which is a notable ongoing investment. And I think it's important to note that when you're facing a budget deficit, that some of these areas are actually places where we've normally seen cuts in the early years of a budget deficit, and the protection of those, I think, shows a strategy that the administration has that's admirable. It also reflects the prudent work to manage the budget well generally speaking, over the last decade. I think there's also smart solutions to the deficit the administration is using. The pulling back of one-time commitments that were made when we were in a time of surplus is the right balance. You sort of, when you have the money, you sort of say, hey, if we can, we're going to put some one-time money into things. And then if you have to, you pull back on that. That's better than having to cut at the core of things. The deferral of some infrastructure projects, while we know that infrastructure investment is needed, those are smart things to do in the early years of a deficit period. Some of the things that we think, are sort of missed opportunities in the budget, and there aren't a lot of them. I want to be clear about that. I think it seems like a pretty solid budget overall, but there are a couple of systems that are facing some looming challenges or are already in crisis that I would just raise that may need some attention, even if that's one-time attention amid a difficult fiscal time, admittedly. But in the food assistance space, there is federal expansion of emergency benefits that expires in February, which means people get their last checks in March. But for an average household, that's about $80 a household. For really low income households, it's about $200 a month. So that loss of expanded food assistance at a time when we're looking at an economic downturn that most folks are predicting will be worse, means that we'll have more kids. This food assistance primarily supports kids who will be showing up in education programs, less nourished, less fed, and that's not a good situation. And so it seems like a place where, given the overall economic conditions, a place for some one-time attention. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this in my remarks, but I also think there's sort of a lack of attention to the crisis that is in the childcare space and the challenge that expanding TK is presenting for childcare. And I'll say just a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So those are the things, the sort of big picture observations that we have about the budget. In the cradle to career space specifically, the continued commitment by the administration to the investment in universal TK for 4-year-olds, now in its first year of implementation, certainly, a good thing for our state, nation leading thing we're doing in the state. I'll say more, there's a little bit more attention to the interaction with other systems that's needed, but that commitment to that investment is still in the budget, as Chris was saying. In K through 12, the supplemental funding for K through 12 in the Prop 98 space, in the minimum guarantee, given that, as Chris said, the decline in revenues for the state means there is otherwise kind of a shifting down of the Prop 98 guarantee. The administration does try to put some supplemental funding in to try to keep the overall funding level higher. I think there's a potentially very exciting piece in the administration's proposal, which is the addition of an equity multiplier, which is basically a way that there's not a lot of details in the budget summary, but the briefings that Chris and his colleagues at the Department of Finance have been holding for the education community have talked about this being something where it would target the $300 million that's committed to add on to the local control funding formula to elementary schools with a 90% plus, where there are 90% plus students, or high schools with 85% plus students that are eligible for free meals. So it's an effort to get additional dollars, targeted dollars into lowest income schools that are serving high concentrations of low income students. I note it also doesn't say free and reduced price. So it's really, if you think about that, it's trying to get the dollars into the very, very lowest income schools and address achievement gaps, as Chris, I think, was noting earlier, as a strategy across. So there's a lot of details to be sorted out. I know some folks in particularly the Black community are a little bit concerned that the dollars may, that there may need to be accountability provisions that make sure the dollars are spent as they're intended. And that's always a tension in the K through 12 space or the education space. How do you provide some flexibility locally, but how do you make sure there's accountability for the dollars being spent? That's been a long debate in the local control funding formula space, but I think it's laudable that the administration is going even beyond the local control funding formula to try to target dollars to districts that are serving high concentrations of disadvantaged students. Also notable, I think, is the continuation of the administration's commitment in earlier years to community schools, which support schools' efforts to align with partners, local governments, others in the community to help improve outcomes for students. This is an area that was significantly invested in over the last couple of years. I think we have to keep an eye on it. It's notable to us at the Budget Center that the Legislative Analyst's Office has identified that as a place that they think the administration could cut if need be. But it's also a very good policy policy that was put in place through prior years' budgets. So it's the kind of thing you'd ideally not like to see cut. So I think it's an area to watch as we get closer to the May revision. And then lastly, in K through 12, I'd say that there's the additional $250 million the administration is proposing for literary coaches and reading specialists is a positive development in that it's targeted to elementary schools that are also, here again, serving kids at high concentrations of kids who are in poverty. So another good piece to the administration's proposal that adds on dollars to something that was started during the current fiscal year. In the higher ed space, I don't have a lot to add to what Chris said. It's good news. It's good news in the sense that in a deficit year, base increases and cost of living increases for the community college system, the CSU system, the UC system go forward. There's, in some instances, there's some additional dollars to help with enrollment declines. I think those dollars can potentially be very equity focused in the sense that we know from the data that's coming in that the pandemic's effect on disenrollment and students leaving the system has disproportionate effects on low-income students and students of color. So those additional enrollment assistance dollars, I think, have an equity target or an equity focus to them as well. If there is a place in the budget that I think is a concern for us and for advocates that we work with in many instances, is that there's not a lot that's being done in the childcare space. And this is a system that was very underinvested in coming into the pandemic, has been hit very hard by the pandemic in terms of the loss of providers and things like additional facilities needs. And the administration and the legislature have tried to provide some support in terms of additional slots, facilities grants, those kinds of things in earlier years. But it's an area where there's not any new news, and some expansion of childcare slots is actually pushed out to the next fiscal year in the budget proposal. There's not anything yet being done on reimbursement rates, but there is that union collective bargaining negotiation coming. And I know there's a big push coming from advocates. Lots of folks in the legislature want to talk about and do something about the reimbursement rate issue. So we may see something happen there. But I think the thing that we're going to have to deal with public policy wise coming very soon is that there's a potentially big challenge for the loss of childcare providers as a result of the transitional kindergarten expansion. And I want to be very clear that I think the universal transitional kindergarten for 4-year-olds is a good thing for the state. It's a good thing for the kids who will be able to access that. But the realities about how the system works is that, that the jobs in the TK space are better paying. They have better benefits in many instances. They're shorter hours, a lot better work for those providers. And the most natural fit for attracting folks into that space are childcare providers and other pre-K providers. And in the first few months of implementation, the reports coming out of childcare providers in particular around the state is folks are already sort of closing up rooms. Certain centers are closing because they're losing both providers into the TK system, and they're also losing 4-year-olds out of the childcare centers to the TK system, which may be a good thing for those kids in many instances. But the 4-year-old part of the 0 to 4 childcare system is really the key to keeping it going. The ratios of staff to kids are lower. It's more financially viable for the childcare providers. So if they lose their 4-year-olds, many childcare centers, licensed childcare centers, are going to have a hard time serving as many kids or keeping their doors open. And so the integration of this system, actually building out a mixed delivery system, is a work in progress, I guess I would say. Like, we shouldn't see it as a reason to scuttle transitional kindergarten, but we do have to keep working on the integration of the system and how that implementation looks going forward. Last thing I'll just say that about the budget, 2 other areas that I know are of interest to your folks, workforce and broadband. The workforce space is a space where there are some pulling back of earlier commitments. It's one of the areas of the budget where that happens. Areas that take some reductions are apprenticeship program, trying to put more public health workforce in place, a women in construction program. So those are unfortunate, but they're probably also, like a $25 billion or $23 billion deficit is going to mean some things are reduced somewhere along the way. So that's one area where that happens. In the broadband space, people who might read the governor's budget summary or hear about this will probably hear that slowing down of the rollout of the middle mile and last mile build out of broadband might sound like a bad thing, deferring that to like a year later and a couple of years later. But I will tell you that, at least from talking to a lot of advocates who have equity as a focus in that work, they're actually pretty encouraged that the slowdown of that might actually make sure that the design and then the implementation gets to the communities that are needed and has better equity outcomes, rather than moving too quickly and having that build out happen in a way that doesn't produce the sort of equity outcomes that we want. So that may not necessarily be a bad thing when you're sort of trying to build out something large, new, and you're trying to do it with and meet some outcomes that have been hard to meet in prior investments. So I will stop there. That's our kind of overall take on education systems and things that sort of support the system. Like I said, I think it's a pretty solid budget overall. There's some deliberations with the legislature and with advocates that are going to happen in the weeks and months ahead. And we probably have a situation where the conditions for the state revenue picture anyway might worsen or more likely to worsen by May. So we may have to think more about some of these solutions. And there may be some hard choices ahead, but I think the administration's tried to maintain its commitments made in prior years, as Chris was saying, and there's lots of opportunities to think about smart ways to deal with future investments, and or if we've got to cut some things back, there's probably some ways to do that that'll be less painful than if we hadn't made all these earlier investments in early years.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Chris. And questions are definitely starting to flow in. So I'm going to start with one related to your comments on the K-12 equity multiplier. Thank you for touching on that. And because we're receiving some questions, is there any additional commentary you want to make on that equity multiplier, including there's a question about when more details might be available?
So Chris probably knows more, but my understanding is the trailer bill language is coming out sometime in the next week. I don't want to, I may be overselling that. It may take a little longer, but I think we're going to know more relatively soon, but I defer to Chris on this.
Yeah, certainly our goal is February 1st. That is generally the statutory guidelines for releasing all trailer bill to implement the budget. So that's when folks should expect more detail. Certainly the accountability provisions and a focus on schools, as opposed to the current focus on districts, will be an important aspect of that proposal. And, certainly we're focused on closing equity gaps. We're focused on how we can better serve all students in those schools where we know that there might be some students that we know the dashboard shows that there are students that are struggling. And really that's the focus. So certainly when the language comes out, would encourage folks to look at both the equity multiplier and the accountability provisions together as one package.
Thank you so much for that. And Chris Ferguson wanted to see if you wanted to weigh in. Chris Hoene, thank you so much for your comments around the infant and toddler care and the expansion of UTK. We do have a question from one of our participants in the chat, Rachel Klein. And Chris Ferguson, I was hoping you might share your commentary just around what the conversation has been around these investments in infant and toddler care with the expansion of UTK, and just, of course, the significant impact that will have on the greater childcare infrastructure.
Yeah, I think we in last year's budget, we acknowledged that there would be some impacts, especially on the California State Preschool Program, which is part of that infrastructure. And there was an adjustment factor placed in for serving 3-year-old children, knowing that, the economics and the ratios and the support would be different. So we tried to provide additional support in that from that perspective. But in large part, I think we view it as a true, and Chris is correct, we view it as a true mixed delivery system that we're attempting to build out, so that parents have options, they have choices as to what they think meets the mark for their child and for their needs. At the same time, we're also encouraging, providers, whether that's childcare, whether that's, preschool, whether that's expanded learning opportunities program or transitional kindergarten, to work together to provide holistic programs that are working for our families and our kids throughout the state. So, what do I mean by that? I mean, can you provide opportunities for wrap care where, say, the school might be providing, TK services from, say, 9 to 1, and then you use a preschool program to serve from, say, 1 to 5. And then can you use expanded learning to say, well, actually, we can even take that up to 7 o'clock in the morning and all the way down to, say, 7 o'clock at night, depending on where you're at, to really think about the opportunities to work together as one system, one mixed delivery system. But we recognize that we need all of the components of the mixed delivery system to be working well for parents, so that they have those options. We don't have any intent to, try to say that one program is looked at more favorably than another. The governor has been clear. We believe in that solid mixed delivery system.
Thank you for that. Chris Hoene, did you want to offer any additional comment there?
No, I appreciate that. And I think that if you looked across the last several years' budgets and the investments that the administration has proposed and worked on the legislature with, that's what Chris just said, I think is evident. And I think, now we're facing a budget deficit where not everything is possible. But I think the thing that is, the thing that's most challenging here is that it is a very complex system. So it's in order to do this well, it's integrating pre-K, TK, childcare, and after school or aftercare. And that's a lot of programs and services that all have to kind of like work together really well so that you don't have parents who are doing all the work for multiple kids of like multiple facilities, multiple programs, multiple pickups and drop-offs each, like this becomes very unsustainable for the parent pretty quickly. In all of those providers, it tends to be the childcare providers who do a lot of the gap filling. So like if the parents can't do the drop off and pickup, it's often the childcare providers who are making the transition to a TK program or whatever the case may be. And so they're the ones who are most often opening their doors at 7 a.m. and still open at 8 p.m. because of people's work schedules. And, and so I think I think there's more urgency, I guess, overall to try to make some steps toward that integration in that mixed delivery system.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Darcy Harvey in the chat. So this one is for Chris Ferguson. Can you speak a little more about the flexibility in categorical spending? Will this mean using categorical program funding more broadly, possibly for programs that serve more than one population? Or is something else envisioned as flexibility?
Certainly can speak to this. And hi, Darcy. I hope you're doing well. We've worked together in the past on some of these programs. So certainly, I think the way we envision the flexibility to work would be, and we have not identified the programs that would be applicable to it, but certainly like EOPS or disabled students, programs and services. Even our apprenticeship programs, they would not be part of the flexibility concept. But what we're thinking is, within some of those programs like Emoja or Puente, can you provide districts with a level of flexibility that says all of the identified programs, you can spend any of the dollars from those programs within any of those particular programs. So we're not anticipating saying you can take a categorical dollar and spend it, like it's general fund on anything that you would like. Rather, we're sort of viewing it as, can we provide you an opportunity to more holistically craft the programs that will work best in your area, or in many cases, it's just on reducing the administrative burden so that you can craft that holistic approach. Especially in the Central Valley or smaller community college districts, they often struggle to take, say, a $50,000 allocation from, mental health services and a $75,000 allocation from, say, Emoja to hire the staff necessary to operate, the two programs. And it's a struggle. So they may view the flexibility as, as an ability to then truly operate both in a way that works for their district and their students. So that's sort of, how we view the flexibility potential for May.
Thank you for that. And we have another question from our former colleague, Roberto. Roberto, good to see you. He asks, might we anticipate funding cuts in the May revision for the CSU given enrollment declines?
Yeah, so certainly, as Chris mentioned, we can't predict what the revenues will look like at May. But I can say, my advice to the governor would be that we're going to, to maintain our funding for the CSU as proposed, and instead focus on restoring those enrollments in a way that, is focused on the priority sectors in California, that's focused on getting additional students to complete degrees. And then the other piece to think about it on a campus by campus basis potentially is, as we think about Graduation Initiative 2025 and the goals of, increasing four-year grad rates as the goals of, closing all equity gaps, one of the strategies has been to increase course sections and bottleneck courses. Well, you can increase FTES, full-time equivalent students, using some of that space and really try to make more progress toward those goals, which actually then creates even more capacity to serve additional students. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but to be very blunt, my advice to the governor would not be to adjust the CSU, UC budgets for enrollment declines in May.
Thank you. And a question that has come up actually for both of you. Do either of you have any comments on the California budget reserves and whether we would pull from this in the near term?
Yeah, I think, very clearly at his, budget press conference, the governor signaled that would be something that they would look toward at the May revision if the situation, deteriorates between the governor's budget and the May revision. Because we want to maintain the progress that's out there, but we also wanted to maintain those reserves so that we weren't, effectively firing the bullet right now, so that we would have the opportunities. And that's, both on the BSA, which is the larger stabilization account, and the K-12 rainy or K-14 rainy day fund. So both have been maintained, knowing that if the situation declines between governor's budget in May, that we would have the ability to look toward both. And just to be clear, on the K-14 side, there's two tests to it. One is a mandatory withdrawal based on a formula and law, and the other is if the governor does declare a fiscal emergency, discretionary withdrawals can be made from that account. And on the stabilization side, it does require the governor to declare a fiscal emergency to pull funds from the main stabilization account as well.
Yeah, I would just add that very much along the lines of what Chris is saying, as we've been advising advocates and folks who are, going to do the work of trying to push, at the legislature and the governor for various sorts of things. We received a lot of questions about why aren't the reserves being used, and we don't have a crystal ball into the governor's thinking, and I haven't talked with Chris individually about this or folks at Department of Finance, but my interpretation all along has been that this was just kind of holding some tools back because we don't know a lot about what things are going to look like in May from a revenue perspective. There are lots of mixed indicators about the economy. As the governor said in his press conference, there's not a prediction as of yet that we're headed into a recession, but the things that drive the state's revenue growth or decline aren't doing great. Like there's lots of other indicators that are doing fine, but like stock market gains and things like that over a month-to-month period have not been driving the revenues the way they once did. And so if we face a bigger budget shortfall in May, having those reserves there, would probably be more likely to be one of the tools that's used. I think it's pretty smart fiscal policy, given the state's history, to remember that most recessions or economic downturns have had multi-year effects on budget shortfalls. So you don't, as Chris was saying, there are rules that sort of keep you from using all of the reserves in the first year anyway, but where you want to sort of figure out how to use that as one of the tools over a couple of years if you need to.
Thank you. And we have a couple of minutes left, still questions coming in. So we will share these questions. For any that we can't get to, we'll share them with you. And maybe there's a way we can share out any responses via email. But Chris Hoene, you shared a lot of things that are really exciting in the proposed 2023 budget, but we do have an anonymous question in the chat asking what excites you the most? So if you had to pick one thing that excites you the most.
Yeah, I think it's where I started. I think the fact that the state's facing a budget shortfall and that there's an overall commitment to maintaining ongoing core programs and services, things that, and particularly expansions from the last several years, I think is really good news for the state. It may seem a little bit non-newsworthy or less newsworthy that like there's a lot of, we're continuing what we did in the current fiscal year or the prior fiscal year, but that continuation in many instances is of expanded programs, additional investments, commitments that have been made. And as I said at the beginning, that oftentimes core programs and services, particularly in spaces like safety net services, are where we see cuts early. And to see those protected early, I think is a good thing for protecting conditions for the Californians who themselves are most harmed by things like economic downturns.
Fantastic. And I wish we could get to all of these questions, but we're getting towards the end of our hour. Let me just see if I can work in one more. The next on the list is from Teresa Nuno. It's great to hear about the money being invested in some of these regional partnerships, developing these regional collaboratives. And she's wondering if there are any incentives or accountability measures to ensure those cross-system collaboratives are resulting in student success in the education system. So I guess any talk of additional incentives or accountability measures, assessing some of the dollars being invested in these regional partnerships.
Yeah, so I think from our perspective, the incentives really are around or student. It's not that they're focused on the institution so much as we're focused on the student and providing the opportunities to the students in ways that we think works for schools, in ways that we think works for the college system and for training partners. And what I mean by that is we know that, for example, there are staffing challenges. Well, if you can establish a well thought out dual enrollment program, you may be able to help with some of those shortages by offering, an opportunity for a community college course where that student might gain, units toward a degree or experience toward a particular outcome. Prior budgets have provided some incentives. So, for example, in last year's budget, we did provide, as part of the Golden State Pathways approach, we did provide dollars to K-12 entities to try and enter into dual enrollment approaches. So certainly that's an incentive to say, we want you to do this, and here's some funding to help bridge, all of the staffing to, not only enter into the agreement, but figure out what the course schedule would look like, how you can navigate, the provision of services and where they would be. So I think from our perspective, that's a lot of the focus, but we also know that we need to create the environment for folks to be able to do that. So we also haven't put forward, the types of restrictions or the types of, constructs that would prevent folks from working together as well. I do in all of my conversations with system leaders, it's a consistent, work with your communities, work across the systems. That is, a consistent theme that we have with system leadership.
Thank you so much. And I wish we had more time with you. Still more questions coming in. Thank you so much to all of our partners and participants who dialed in. We're really grateful for your engagement and all of the insightful questions. Chris Ferguson and Chris Hoene, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. I hope you'll join us again next year, same time, same place. And Unite LA will share information on upcoming webinars via email. So we look forward to our next conversation with partners across the region and across the state. And until then, thank you all, and we look forward to connecting again soon.